What if the most powerful ideas in history didn't survive because they were the strongest? What if they survived because someone quietly carried them? Across thousands of years, civilizations have risen and fallen. Empires have collapsed. Libraries have burned. Languages have disappeared. Entire cultures have changed beyond recognition. And yet, somehow, some ideas continue. Justice, compassion, hospitality, the search for truth, the passing of wisdom from one generation to the next. Some people explain that by pointing to the enduring power of certain ideas. Others point to education, institutions, or culture. There are others who believe human beings naturally preserve what they find most meaningful. Whether any of those explanations are correct isn't the question we're exploring today. Instead, I'd like to ask something much simpler. If an idea survives for thousands of years, what kind of work must someone have been doing all along? Today, I'd like to walk through a few moments from history and ask a different question. Not what survived, but who carried it. And as we place these stories beside one another, perhaps we'll notice something quietly recurring beneath them all. History is filled with things that disappear. Cities rise and fall. Empires expand and eventually fade. Languages emerge, evolve, and sometimes vanish altogether. Entire ways of life can be transformed within only a few generations. Even the greatest monuments eventually weather beneath wind, water, and time. And yet, something remarkable seems to happen alongside all of that change. Some ideas continue. Long after the people who first spoke them are gone. Long after the kingdoms that protected them have disappeared. Long after the civilizations that first gave them shape have been absorbed into history. And not every idea survives. Most don't. But some do. You're listening to The Occult and the Apocalypse, where we explore the hidden and the revealed through patterns, symbolisms, and awareness. Not to predict, but to notice, and not to conclude, but to understand. That alone is worth pausing to notice. How does an idea cultivate the civilization that first imagined it? For most of human history, the answer was obscure. Long before books filled libraries, knowledge traveled through memory. Stories were spoken around fires, songs carried history, laws were remembered aloud. Parents taught children, elders taught communities. Entire cultures entrusted their understanding of the world to living human beings, generation after generation. Then writing emerged. Ideas could outlive the people who first spoke them. Centuries later, great centers of learning, like the Library of Alexandria, reflected an extraordinary human impulse, not only to create knowledge, but to gather it, preserve it, and pass it forward. According to ancient accounts, books arriving in Alexandria were copied before continuing on their journey, a remarkable symbol of humanity's growing desire to keep wisdom from being lost. Then another transformation arrived. The printing press allowed ideas to travel farther and faster than any individual teacher ever could. Knowledge that once existed in only a handful of handwritten manuscripts could suddenly reach entire populations. Each generation seemed to discover a better way to preserve what it believed mattered. And yet, none of those methods could decide what was worth preserving. A library cannot choose which stories matter. A printing press cannot decide which ideas deserve another generation. Even the greatest archive simply waits for someone to place something inside of it. Perhaps the methods were never the whole story, because behind every method, there was always a person. A grandmother teaching her language to a grandchild. A monk patiently copying a manuscript, one careful line at a time. An artisan showing an apprentice how to shape wood, stone, or metal with practiced hands. A scientist mentoring a student, not simply passing along information, but teaching them how to ask better questions and how to understand the answers. Different centuries, different cultures, different kinds of knowledge. And yet, whenever something meaningful survives, someone like this seems to be there. Perhaps before asking what survives, we should ask a different question. What kind of work has someone been quietly doing all along? As we step back from these stories, something begins to feel surprisingly familiar. A grandmother teaching a language, a monk patiently copying manuscripts, an artisan guiding an apprentice, a scientist mentoring the next generation. Different centuries, different cultures, different kinds of knowledge, and yet they all seem to be solving remarkably similar problems. Not simply preserving information, but ensuring that something meaningful continues after they're gone. Perhaps that's why researchers from so many different fields often arrive at observations that sound surprisingly familiar, even when they're asking very different questions. Anthropologists have long observed that every culture must somehow pass knowledge from one generation to the next. Languages, customs, practical skills, moral traditions, and shared stories survive only because communities continually transmit them through relationships, teaching, and participation. Systems theorists often notice something different. As systems become more complex, they rarely expect every member to perform exactly the same work. Healthy systems tend to differentiate. Different people or different parts of the system begin carrying different responsibilities, allowing the whole to remain flexible enough to adapt while still preserving what matters. Even developmental psychologists notice something similar when they observe children at play. No one assigns the roles. Maybe one child invents the game, and another explains the rules to everyone else. Someone else then notices when the rules are no longer fair, and another may suggest a better way to play. A few minutes later, those same children may exchange roles entirely. The work changes because the needs of the group change. Perhaps that's the remarkable part. across history, across cultures, across scientific disciplines, even across childhood itself, we seem to encounter the same quiet movement. Not necessarily the same kind of people, but the same kinds of work. And perhaps that invites a different question altogether. What civilizations don't repeatedly produce the same And perhaps that invites a different question altogether. What if civilizations don't repeatedly produce the same personalities? What if they repeatedly call forth the same kinds of work whenever something meaningful is going to survive? Perhaps that's the doorway we've been walking toward all along. As I continued exploring this question, I found myself searching for language that would describe what I kept noticing. These didn't seem to be recurring personalities. The same person could embody very different kinds of work at different moments in life. A teacher may become an innovator. An explorer might eventually become a mentor. Someone who once challenged a tradition may later spend years preserving the wisdom they had discovered. Nor did they seem to be rigid roles. Instead, they felt more like recurring functions. The kind of work that seems to appear whenever something meaningful is carried from one generation to the next. For my own thinking, I began giving those functions simple names, not because they're the only names that could be used, but because they carry some of humanity's oldest symbols. The farmer, the shepherd, and the hunter. The farmer represents the work of cultivation. The people who ask new questions, explore unfamiliar ground, plant new ideas, and make discoveries that expand what a community believes is possible. Without cultivation, nothing new enters the field. The shepherd represents the work of transmission, the people who teach, mentor, preserve, and patiently carry wisdom into the lives of others until it becomes part of a living tradition. Without transmission, even the greatest discoveries disappear within a generation. The hunter represents the work of discernment, the people who protect, examine, establish healthy boundaries, and ask whether what is being carried forward still serves life in the way that it was meant to. Without discernment, communities risk preserving things that no longer help them flourish. None of these functions is complete on its own. Cultivation without transmission eventually fades. Transmission without cultivation slowly becomes stagnant. Discernment without compassion can become control. Cultivation without discernment can outrun wisdom. Transmission without renewal can harden into rigidity. Only together do they become a healthy ecosystem. Perhaps that's why these patterns seem to appear again and again. Not because every civilization produces the same kinds of people, but because every civilization, if it hopes to carry something meaningful into the future, eventually needs this work to be done. If these are really recurring functions rather than fixed personalities, then perhaps the most important question isn't whether they exist. Perhaps it's what happens when they fall out of balance. History offers no shortage of opportunities to explore that question. What happens when a civilization stops cultivating? Eventually, it begins repeating yesterday's answers to tomorrow's problems. Innovation slows, curiosity fades, the familiar becomes safer than the possible. Communities may preserve what they already know, but they gradually lose the ability to respond to a changing world. What happens when a civilization stops transmitting? Discoveries still happen. Brilliant ideas still emerge, but without teachers, mentors, parents, and communities willing to carry those ideas forward, they quietly disappear. Wisdom that took generations to discover can vanish within only 1 or 2 generations. And what happens when a civilization stops discerning? Perhaps that question is the most difficult of all. Without discernment, communities may carry everything forward simply because it's always been there. Helpful traditions and harmful habits become equally protected. The willingness to ask difficult questions slowly gives way to preserving familiarity rather than preserving what gives life. Perhaps imbalance doesn't always arrive because one function becomes evil. Perhaps it arises because one function begins carrying more weight than it was ever meant to bear. Cultivation without discernment can outrun wisdom. Transmission without renewal can slowly become rigidity. Discernment without compassion can become control. Each function possesses remarkable strengths. Each also carries the possibility of shadow when separated from the others. And perhaps that's why these functions feel less like identities than seasons. The explorer may eventually become the mentor. The teacher may one day become the reformer. The reformer may later discover that what was once needed changing is now something worth protecting. Life has a way of asking different work from us at different moments. Perhaps healthy civilizations do the same. And as those civilizations grow more complex, something else begins to emerge. Once knowledge has been cultivated, carried, and carefully discerned across generations, there is finally something substantial enough to build. Schools, libraries, communities, institutions. Places where wisdom can take root beyond the lifetime of any one individual. And eventually, another kind of work quietly appears. Someone steps back, not simply to cultivate, not simply to teach, not simply to protect, but to notice, to observe patterns that no single generation could fully see while living inside them. And perhaps what comes next, the builders and the observers, functions that I'll discuss another day, aren't replacements for the earlier functions. Perhaps they emerge because those earlier functions have been faithfully carried for so long. Which brings me back to the question we began with. Perhaps the question was never which function is most important. Perhaps the better question is, what kind of work is this moment asking for? Perhaps that's why these ideas have stayed with me. Not because they explain every civilization, and not because they predict the future. And certainly not because they reduce human beings to three simple categories. If anything, they remind me how remarkably complex we really are. The same person may cultivate in one season of life, teach in another, protect something precious in a third, and one day find themselves building something that will outlast them. Or simply stepping back long enough to notice a pattern that was invisible while they were living inside it. Perhaps that's how healthy civilizations have always grown. Not because everyone did the same work, but because enough people faithfully carried the work that was needed when it was needed. When I look back across history now, I find myself wondering less about the individuals and more about what they chose to carry. A grandmother who refused to let a language disappear. The teacher who patiently shaped another generation. The reformer willing to ask difficult questions. The guardian who protected something worth preserving. And later, the builder who created a place where wisdom could take root. And the observer who noticed a pattern that no one else had yet found words for. Perhaps every one of them inherited something that they did not create. And perhaps every one of them quietly added something before passing it forward. Which makes me wonder, not which function describes you or me best, but what kind of work this moment is asking of me and you. What is worth cultivating? What is worth teaching? What is worth protecting? What is worth building? And what is quietly waiting to be noticed? No one else can answer those questions for us. Each generation answers them in its own way. Perhaps that's how ideas survive, not because they somehow preserve themselves, but because ordinary people again and again choose to carry something they believe is worth handing to the next generation, and perhaps without actually realizing it, we become part of that story too. Thank you for being here with me and helping me take the occult and the apocalypse and see it as just the hidden and the revealed. Come back next week where we are going to talk about mystic schools and secret societies. I'll see you there.